Merry December, everyone! 2023 has been an outstanding year for publishing. Loads of great books have come out. I've had a fantastic year of reading. A lot has happened to me this year and it's been a good one. And here are my best books of 2023. As always, very quickly, I have a few rules for my top lists. Number one, as always, my list is divided into two. Two videos, two separate lists. My top 10 books in translation of 2023 and my top 10 books that were written in English of 2023. Number two, all of these books were published this year, at least in English and in the UK. And number three, I'm only counting novels. There is no non-fiction on this list, and I'm also not counting short stories or short story collections. I'm just going to make it simple and focus on novels and novellas. My next video will be the top 10 English language books of this year, and here are my top 10 books in translation of 2023. At number 10 is a Brazilian novel, Of Cattle and Men by Ana Paula Maia, translated from the Portuguese by Zoe Perry. This is a book that I have a very fond memory of reading, and I really didn't anticipate it being in my top 10 list. But as I look back on the year, this was a book that just wouldn't get out of my brain. A book that has stayed with me from the moment I finished it. I have a very vivid memory of reading it while I was on a train ride from London to York. It's only 100 pages long, so I read it on the ride, and it feels like it's been haunting me ever since. Of Cattle and Men is what you would get if Cormac McCarthy wrote John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Imagine that and you'll be roughly there. Ana Paula Maia's novel tells the story of a man who works at a slaughterhouse in Brazil. He's a hyper-religious man who has a very strict code of ethics, a very strong moral compass based on his religious beliefs. His job in the slaughterhouse is to deliver the death blow to the cattle, and he does so by hitting them over the head with a big wooden mallet. He says a prayer every single time he does, and he believes that every cow goes to heaven. But then one day, and this happens very early in the novel, someone has to replace him for a little while. That person is doing his job for him, and he doesn't like how that man is handling it, so he kills him. His code of ethics compels him to commit murder because the job isn't done in the way that he wants it to be done. And so this is kind of a reverse murder mystery where you know who the killer is and you even know why he did it. It's a very short novella about ethics and morals and about how we see the world, what your code of ethics is, and how our codes of ethics inform our relationships, our social dynamics, our politics, and so much more. The book goes a lot further than what I've described here, but I don't want to spoil it, and it's very easy to spoil a book that's so short, so go check it out. Just be warned, it's kind of a bummer. It left me feeling really, really sad for quite a while, and I was on my way on holiday. I was spending a weekend in York, and it was going to be fun, and the very first thing I did was read this really fantastic novel that unfortunately kind of bummed me out, so be prepared for that. John Steinbeck meets Cormac McCarthy in a slaughterhouse, and it's wild, it's brilliant, it's just quite a downer. Number 9 is a Japanese novel, What You Are Looking For Is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama, translated into English by Alison Watts. This is another book that took me by surprise. I actually didn't have very high hopes for it going into reading it. I thought it was going to be a little too twee, a little vapid and shallow, a book that was good vibes for the sake of good vibes and just left me feeling a little bit nothing at all. And that is so far from the case. This is a book that really, really surprised me, and I welcome that surprise. What You Are Looking For Is in the Library is a collection of stories that are all tied together, not just thematically, but also in terms of their time and place. They're all set around this one library. And at this library is a librarian with a particular gift. Every person whose life we follow in this story is lost in some way. And you can be lost in lots of different ways, as this book shows. Each of them ends up at this library, which is in a small suburb of Tokyo. In my head, very similar to the suburb I used to live in when I lived in Tokyo. A quiet, peaceful place where not much happens, but there's this one library with this one special librarian. And when these lost people go in, they each ask for recommendations based on what they're looking for. They might be looking for something to do with farming, or maybe they're unemployed and they're looking for a book to advise them how to get a job. It could be a book on computing. It could be a book on parenthood. They're all looking for something, and the librarian will give them what they're looking for and one extra book as well. So each of them leaves with a small stack of books. maybe 4 books that will help them with what they need, and a 5th book that has nothing to do with anything at all. There is no rhyme or reason for this person to have this book. If they go in looking for something on computers, they'll walk out with something on octopuses. But each of these people will end up reading that anomalous book, and it will help them get unstuck. It will help them with their life in some very important, meaningful way. It will push them out of their rut and into joy, into happiness. This librarian has a gift for finding the exact thing you need. What you are looking for is in the library. Go watch my review to get my full thoughts, but I just found this to be an incredibly charming and satisfying book. It has a lot more depth of character, depth of narrative, and depth of theme than I expected it to have. And I'm so glad I gave it a chance because it's made my top books of the year list. It's wonderful. Check it out. Number 8 is a Dutch novel, What I'd Rather Not Think About by Jente Postuma, translated into English by Sarah Timmer Harvey. I was looking through my old videos to find my review of this, and it turns out I never did one. I mentioned it in a monthly wrap-up in the summer and in a video about literary fiction, but I never gave it its own review, and that really surprised me because this book is fantastic. It was published by Scribe, and it tells the story of a pair of twins, a man and a woman. The story is told from the woman's point of view, and we know early on, we are braced for this in the blurb and in the opening chapters, that her twin brother will eventually take his own life when the two of them reach the age of 35. We dig into their childhood, we follow them as they grow up. They're very, very close. We watch their relationship and how it changes and how they hit roadblocks and they fall out and become friends again. And when they're ready, the two of them move from their small rural community to Amsterdam. He comes out as gay, the two of them end up in relationships, their boyfriends meet each other, they have house parties, dinner parties, they're happy, they live in apartments close to each other, they are completely bonded as twins. But then when her brother dies, our narrator protagonist is lost. What do you do without your other half? If you've lived your entire life as one half of a pair, what happens when the other half is gone? And this question has been asked a lot in stories, usually about elderly couples who've been married for 50 years and one of them dies, but this is about twins who've been together since the womb. They've been together for 35 years, not having any idea what it's like to not be in each other's pocket. They really are two halves of a whole. And eventually, he doesn't want to live anymore, and she doesn't know how to live without him. And that's what the book's about. How do you live without your other half? What do you do in that situation? He didn't want to be around anymore, but she was never prepared for life without him. And the novel explores their lives. It's told out of chronological order to a point. We flash back and forth between these times where he's alive and no longer with us. And it's incredible. An absolutely wonderful Dutch novel that you need to check out. Number 7 is The Night House by Norwegian legendary crime and mystery author Jo Nesbø. And this was translated into English by Neil Smith. I've never read a Nesbø book before. I never wanted to. I hate gritty police procedural crime drama blah 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 stuff. I hate it all. Stuff that dads read on the beach? No, not my thing. But this is Nesbø's first horror novel. And what's funny about it is I never wanted to read him. I never had any interest in his stuff. And I read the first half of this book and I thought it was crap. So how's it ended up on my top 10 books of the year list? Because of what it does in its second half, or more specifically in its final third. This is a horror novel that feels frighteningly, frustratingly reminiscent of Stephen King. A boilerplate, average, run-of-the-mill piece of horror fiction set in a small town about a teenage boy and some weird stuff happens and you go through the motions and you go, yeah, King has been writing this for decades. Are you going to do something else with this? It's so boring. But the book is separated into 3 parts. Part 1 takes up the first 2/3 and it's really bland. Parts 2 and 3 together take up the final third of the book and they change everything. This is a book that I cannot spoil, I must not spoil, I'm as surprised as you are. A book by an author I've never had any interest in, that is rubbish for the first 2/3, is so good, so clever, so experimental in its final third that I've put it on my list. And that's all I'm gonna say. If you like horror, and you like books that take really bold and weird risks by telling you a boring story for the first 2/3, and beg the reader, without begging them to just keep going, just check it out. Wow. Number 6 is another Japanese novel, The Premonition by Banana Yoshimoto, translated into English by Asa Yoneda. Yoneda is a fantastic translator, and Banana Yoshimoto is one of my favourite Japanese authors. I've read a lot of her books, I've loved them to pieces, and The Premonition was no different. This book was actually originally published in the 80s in Japan, the same year that her most famous work, Kitchen, also came out, and we've only just received it in English translation by a fantastic translator who's really done the book and the author justice. The Premonition is another novella. It's only about 100 pages long. I read it in a day, and at first it's a very simple story about a young girl and her family. She lives a really comfortable life. She lives this happy suburban Tokyo middle-class life where things are fine. She's in her late teens. She has parents and a brother who love her, but she also has a habit of wandering off, going somewhere else, seeing what else is out there. Her family are kind of used to her just going somewhere for a day or two. And one of the places she often goes is to her aunt's house. She has an aunt who's only a few years older than her, who's in her early 20s. This aunt lives alone, she's a music teacher at a school, and she lives very hedonistically. She likes her life, she likes her space, and she spends it how she wants. And our protagonist really looks up to this aunt, so she visits her quite often. And one day, during a visit, moments they share and conversations they have start to dig up memories that our protagonist didn't know she had, filling in holes, gaps in her memory that she didn't know were there. And suddenly, what she thought she understood about her childhood, her family, her relationships, her bonds, it all comes crashing down. But it also kind of doesn't. It all gets reframed and readjusted. Things get skewed. They take a different shape. And the kinds of love that she thought existed are actually different kinds of love. It's very difficult to explain without spoiling it. Again, you can go check out my review. But The Premonition is a fascinating book about love and family and loss and death and relationships, all the things that Yoshimoto always explores. Love and death are her bread and butter. She explores those two themes time and again in all of her books, always in new and strange, interesting ways. She's incredible, and The Premonition is a great example of why she's so great. Don't miss this book. Number 5 is Honeybees and Distant Thunder by Japanese author Riku Onda, translated into English by Philip Gabriel. Initially, I thought this was going to be my book of the year when I first read it, which shows how many great books have actually come along since then. Honeybees and Distant Thunder is amazing. Riku Onda is an incredible Japanese author, and this book is a pretty hefty thing. It took me a few days to get through. I lent it to my partner's mother, who also adored it, and it tells the story of 3 people who are each young concert pianists. They're each very, very different, and we follow all 3 of their stories as they converge in an international music competition. We also occasionally follow other perspectives, like those of the judges. We get to know quite a lot of people as we read through this novel. Honeybees and Distant Thunder is Riku Onda's dedication to the magic of music, what music can offer people in terms of hearing it, learning it, playing it, understanding it, performing it, turning it into your job, judging and critiquing it. Everything you can do with music is kind of explored here, and it's absolutely beautiful. I'm not an expert in classical music. I'm not a pianist, although I've always been tempted to try, because the only instrument I play is the drums, and I'd love to give piano a try because it's technically percussion. If you love music, as I do, as most people do, you're going to get a lot out of this book. A beautiful Japanese novel about 3 people from 3 walks of life who are entering a music competition, all for different reasons. All have things to gain and to lose, and all love music in their own way. It's absolutely beautiful. I read it earlier in the year, it has stayed with me. Go watch my full review to learn more, but yeah, this is absolutely one of my favourite books of this year, and one of my favourite Japanese novels of all time now. Honeybees and Distant Thunder is stunning. Number 4 is a book I will talk about anytime I have an opportunity. It's wonderful. This is Walking Practice by Korean author Dolki Min, translated into English by Victoria Caudle, who did a really amazing job translating something so experimental, strange, surreal, and speculative. Walking Practice is a short sci-fi novel, and it tells the story of an alien that crash-landed on Earth in Korea and has been living here for quite a while now, quite a few years. They don't have a specific gender, and they have the ability to shapeshift. They can transform into a person of any gender, and they do so a lot in order to feast. Because when they first arrived, they tried eating lots of things and found that the tastiest thing on Earth is us. And so our alien feasts on people on a regular basis. They learned about our dating rituals. They got onto a bunch of dating sites and dating apps, and they use things like Tinder to lure in their prey. They go on a date, they go back to that person's home, they have sex, and then they eat them. But where this book gets really interesting, really thematically fascinating, is in how this book explores gender roles and gender dynamics, especially between men and women in the straight dating scene. This is kind of a book about patriarchy, sexism, and gender dynamics. You figure that out pretty quickly when you see how the alien has to behave differently depending on whether or not they have shapeshifted into a man or a woman. How they have to lure their prey in if they're a woman luring in a man versus a man luring in a woman. Women are harder to catch because they're already nervous, defensive, and taking precautions when it comes to what a man might try and do to them. Men, on the other hand, have a lot less to worry about, a lot less to be afraid of, and are a lot easier to catch and eat as a result. It's a really, really fascinating, fantastic, wonderful piece of Korean fiction, an amazing sci-fi story unlike anything I've ever read, and I loved it to pieces. Number 3 is Fingerbone by Japanese author Hiroki Takahashi, translated into English by Takumi Nieda. This is a phenomenal piece of historical fiction. It is a war novel. It's a book I've talked about multiple times at this point, and it's a book that truly left me feeling breathless, exhausted, and like I wanted to give anyone else a hug. Fingerbone is set during World War II, and it tells the story of a nameless Japanese soldier who is fighting in the jungle of Papua New Guinea. About half of the novel, and it's a short one, is set in a field hospital, where a lot of men are dying not just of their bullet wounds, but of disease, of malaria, of exposure to the elements, as was so often true in World Wars I and II. This book is primarily about camaraderie and friendship and what we owe to each other. Our protagonist makes a lot of friends, and those friends die. He forms incredible bonds of brotherhood with these men as they all start to wonder what they're fighting for, what the point of it all is. They feel disheartened, they just want to live, they just want to survive this, and so often they don't. And it is harrowing, it is heartbreaking, and it reminds you of the tragedies of war, the sacrifices these people make. And as you read the novel avoids a lot of larger international politics to remind you that it's about people, and you wonder what these sacrifices are for, what any of it means. Especially when you consider this is a Japanese novel. Japan lost World War II, and I guess if your country wins a war, you can at least tell yourself that the sacrifices of the men at the front were worth something. But if your country loses, it's heartbreaking. It's a really heartbreaking book. I loved Fingerbone to bits. I think it's an amazing book, a wonderful Japanese novel, an incredible piece of historical war fiction. Check it out if you haven't already. It's amazing. Number 2 is A Little Luck by Argentinian author Claudia Pinheiro, who also wrote Elena Knows, which is an amazing novel. So many people love that book. And it's also recently been turned into a film or a TV series, or it's going to be. I can't remember, but Elena Knows is great, and A Little Luck is even better, at least in my opinion. A Little Luck is another heartbreaking story. I cried reading this. I cried twice, as I said in my review. It tells the story of an Argentinian woman from Buenos Aires who has spent decades now living in Boston, Massachusetts, married to an American man who has recently died. She fled Buenos Aires and she never looked back. She has not been back to the country since, and we don't know why. We only know the panic of it all. We only know that she really fled. Something chased her out, something she did, something she saw, we don't know. What we do know is now that her husband is dead, her work has called her back to a visit to Buenos Aires. She's going back there for some kind of work trip. And as she's journeying back on the plane at the airport, we flash back through her mind, through her memories, and we slowly learn what happened. The book also has this wonderful piece of repetition, where every few chapters, we get a small chapter repeated, but lengthened a little bit each time. First, it's a paragraph. Then that paragraph gets repeated after a few more chapters, but with an extra bit, and it gets longer and longer and longer, and that is revealing the truth of what really happened to her. As she's remembering it and then cutting it off and going, no, don't think about it. Okay, well, remember it again, what happened, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And you know it has something to do with her in a car waiting at a rail crossing for a train to go past. That's all you know at first, and so your mind starts spinning with possibilities. Check out my review to know more. As I keep saying, A Little Luck is a remarkable piece of literary Argentinian fiction, an amazing novel that, as I said, had me crying twice. I love Argentinian fiction, I talk about this a lot. Claudia Pinheiro is an amazing author, one of the best that I've read in years. I love her, I love this book. Please, if you haven't read A Little Luck yet, go out, get it from your library or buy it, just read it now. And finally, my number one book in translation of 2023 is Mary, or The Birth of Frankenstein, by Dutch author Anne Eickhout, translated into English by Laura Watkinson. If you know anything about me and my channel, it's probably not a big surprise that this is my number one. I love Dutch literature, I love Gothic literature, I love historical literature, and Frankenstein is my favourite novel. It couldn't have been anything else. But it also could have been, because this book could have been bad. There's no guarantee that it was going to be perfect, that it would stick the landing, but it did. Mary, or The Birth of Frankenstein, is outstanding. It's astonishing. It is a masterpiece of Gothic historical fiction. It's got elements of horror, and it's also a sapphic love story. This is a novel that tells the story of Mary Shelley before Frankenstein was a thing. It's set in 2 different summers during her teenagehood. Mary Shelley was famously only 20 years old when Frankenstein was published. She started writing it as a teenager. This is one of the most famous things about that book, and it continues to be a miraculous, almost impossible thing. This book, to a point, explores how all of that was possible. One of the summers that the book is set in is the summer that she had the idea for Frankenstein. The summer where she and her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, and a bunch of their friends, including the poet Lord Byron, all hung out by Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and they told each other ghost stories by the fireside. This is that story, but written in enormous detail, with a real focus on the fact that Mary has just had a child, William, and she's terrified of losing him because she already lost one child before. Her first baby died days or weeks into its life, and she's so afraid of losing William, and she's having a complete breakdown about it. And this fear, this loss, plus her relationship to her father and her husband, all of it leads to the creation of Frankenstein. And the other summer, which actually takes up a larger portion of the book, is set 2 years before that, where Mary's only about 15 years old, and she spends a summer in Dundee in Scotland. Her father has sent her up there because she's not feeling very well, and back then they believed in taking in the fresh air and blah blah blah. While she's there, she stays with a family, and that family has a daughter who's very reclusive and is mourning the loss of her mother. But Mary and this girl eventually become friends. Mary lures her out of her room, they become very good friends, and eventually enter into a very passionate, romantic, and sexual lesbian romance. It's beautiful. This is a novel that explores the bisexuality of Mary Shelley, and it's absolutely stunning. This is a novel about aesthetics, the ways in which Mary is exploring her body and the bodies of those that she loves, and the ways in which she's thinking about birth, creating life, giving life, nourishing life. There is a lot of aesthetics, a lot of body image, a lot that feeds into what Frankenstein would eventually become, a novel about birth and creation and bodies. It's a stunning work of horror-tinged, sapphic, historical, Gothic fiction from an amazing Dutch author, a masterpiece, and my favourite book in translation of 2023. Please read Mary, or The Birth of Frankenstein. What a masterpiece. Thank you to Pushkin Press for publishing this in the UK. Wow. There you have it, that is part 1 of 2 videos on my best books of this year. If you've enjoyed this and you've gotten a lot out of my work this year, if you've enjoyed my videos and you want to support me, you can do so on Patreon. It would be a lovely Christmas present. Those were my top 10 books in translation of 2023. Next time, my top 10 English language books of 2023. Look forward to that and subscribe for books.